When you realize that today's opioid crisis has basically happened multiple times before, it ups the stakes.
Opioid addiction has been a complex and persistent part of New York City since the Civil War.
New York has really been the world capital of heroin addiction for the 19th and 20th centuries.
The city's long history with opioids is a story of brutal and stubborn resilience that sits upon an intractable number of victims and survivors.
If you actually look at the history of who was using what in New York City, you see a much more complex picture. It's almost like different strata were laid down over time.
Each layer has left a complicated portrait of supply and demand, and a broad snapshot of the social, economic, and public health impacts from a drug that the city has never been able to kick.
Opioids are a drug that makes you feel warm and safe and loved. And New York is a hard place to feel okay.
The story of heroin in New York really starts in the 19th century, and it doesn't start with heroin. It starts with opium and morphine.
It's a major, major port city. In the early 1800s, the period when the U.S. starts getting really involved in trade with China, for example, New York City is home to some of the merchant firms that are going to basically siphon off opium from the existing opium trade in the Pacific.
Opium poppies are grown in the global south. The colonial powers who divvied up the world's opium supply, they made sure that refinement took place in the global north, in Edinburgh, Scotland, in New York City, in Philadelphia. And ultimately, the profit comes from the refinement.
And so the vast majority of opium is imported into the U.S. and turned into things like morphine and other opioid compounds.
In the mid-1800s, doctors began to use opioids as a tool to treat patients with a number of different ailments.
They were especially used for respiratory and gastrointestinal illnesses. So think cholera, think typhus.
Medicine was fairly primitive in those days, and so the biggest thing that you could do effectively was to relieve pain.
As opiates became increasingly popular, the country would arrive at a major inflection point.
Really the first time that a large cohort of white males become addicted to opiates is during and after the Civil War, when things like amputations, unhealed gunshot wounds, lingering diseases that are picked up in Civil War camps and hospitals. There's this hospital in Philadelphia during the Civil War called Turner's Lane Hospital, where doctors in their records from the hospital report giving thousands and thousands of morphine injections to several hundred soldiers over just 1 year of the Civil War.
We also know that the large majority, 60–70% or more, of morphine addicts in the late 19th century were female.
And the predominant pathway for that addiction to occur was through a physician's prescription and a pharmacist's sale.
Who goes to doctors in the late 19th century most often? Answer: women.
Physicians were prescribing women morphine to treat everything from morning sickness to menstrual cramps. One such patient was a Brooklyn woman named Matilda Webster.
Mrs. Matilda Webster was the mother of 9 children, and she fairly often sent her children down the street to a pharmacist where she could obtain several grains of morphine. And so, one day she happened to have one of her terrible splitting headaches, and she sent one of the 9 children, a relatively young one, down the street, and she did it all and died of an overdose.
A widower with 9 children, Matilda's husband sued the pharmacist.
And that suit wound its way through court, and ultimately there was a settlement for $5,000.
But the country's very first opioid settlement did little to curtail the rising quantity of opium entering the country and the number of prescriptions being written. Between 1870 and 1890, the importation of medical opiates tripled, the influx coming alongside an even more efficient way to ingest the resulting morphine.
During the Civil War, there's such an acute, pressing need for pain relief that American doctors started experimenting with the hypodermic syringe.
Eventually, the syringe made its way from the battlefield to homes.
So whereas 20 years before, these women may have been taking an opium pill, now they are receiving injections of morphine, and a number of them started to take up the practice themselves once they learned how to do it.
There were many, many reported deaths from overdose from a variety of sources, including people who were working in factories in Brooklyn and in Manhattan where opioids were being refined.
And so when the media begins fixating on this opioid crisis that's developing in the 1870s and 80s, there are all these stories about how in New York City the crisis appears to be worse than everywhere else.
But this rising tide of concern would do little to prevent the introduction of an entirely new opioid product. Created by the German company Bayer and advertised as a cough suppressant, heroin arrived on the shelves of American pharmacies in 1898.
It was a pretty minor entrant into a fairly crowded field of opioid pharmaceuticals. And so it would have just entered New York City pharmacies as it did everywhere else. It's sitting alongside morphine, it's sitting alongside codeine, sitting alongside laudanum, opium gum.
But by the early 20th century, doctors are starting to wise up about opiates, and they're certainly more cautious in prescribing large quantities of these drugs to patients with chronic painful conditions.
Alongside this growing concern from doctors, a racial element began to emerge.
As always with every kind of drug scare in the US, there seems to be a racial angle to it. Smoking opium was associated with Chinese immigrants.
And there are all kinds of media stories or exposés about opium dens in New York City. So one of the narratives is that these are places where Chinese immigrant opium smokers would attract white women and get them enslaved to opium.
This idea that white women were getting lured into opium dens where they might become sexually available to non-white men was the stuff of nightmares for the self-appointed leaders of the white race.
The sort of media frenzy or media panic surrounding Chinese opium smoking, it's sort of like spun out of control by those who would seek to ban Chinese immigration in the 1880s. And so it becomes kind of a Chinese immigrant opium smokers become a convenient scapegoat.
In 1909, the federal government enacted the very first national drug prohibition law, banning the import of opium.
Heroin had been introduced about a decade ago, and it was still legal to buy in pharmacies. So you see a switch from the consumers who had been smoking opium, they switch over to heroin for injection.
Heroin plugs into and becomes a substitute for the opium and morphine that was involved in this first big epidemic. And then heroin also has a kind of independent life in the underworld.
It becomes so much more dangerous to be a drug user in New York City. Overdoses are already a common feature of life as a drug user, but after heroin, it's so much more powerful. It's so easy to miscalculate a dose that overdoses escalate even more.
You started sniffing heroin with your companions in 1910.
That's right, that's correct.
In the early 1980s, historian David Courtwright and public health professors Don DeJarle and Herman Joseph conducted a series of interviews with opioid users, like Leroy Street, who was a teenager when he started using.
It only took about a month to get addicted to it, and then we had to go buy a drug ourselves.
So you were addicted fairly quickly. Now,
in a few days. It only takes a few days of continuous using it to pick up a habit.
And you were sniffing practically pure heroin at the time.
At that time, I had pure heroin. What we got came from Germany, Bayer and Bayer's, and
right.
8 bottles, and it was 100% pure.
Leroy Street was using during a period of transition as the federal government began cracking down on narcotics, and the country was moving toward prohibition of alcohol. The early wave of restrictions that started in 1909 were followed in 1914 by the Harrison Act, which was the first federal attempt to curb addiction. By 1924, heroin was prohibited entirely.
So basically you were addicted from 1910 until 1923, and then you have not used anything since?
No, not since, thank God for that.
But for those who didn't stop using, heroin was now a product of the black market.
Big money earner for bootleggers and organized criminals, of course, is alcohol. But narcotics are a very lucrative sideline, and they make a lot of money out of it. And in some ways, it's a natural. I mean, if you're in the business of smuggling alcohol, why not also get in the business of smuggling narcotics?
Heroin is a cooked down version of those other opioids. And so hence it's easier to smuggle. Just, gram for gram, ounce per ounce, pound for pound, ton per ton. You get more bang for your buck there.
By the end of the 20s, the black market was booming, and heroin was widely available for users.
There were people who worked in laundries, there were people who worked in grocery stores, there were people who had legitimate jobs who were daily dependent users of heroin.
How much was the heroin at that time?
50 cents a deck.
50 cents a deck?
A deck at
now,
that time, in the 30s.
How long would a deck last you?
2 days.
2 days?
That's how strong the stuff. You could take half of it, and 2 guys would get high off it, you see? And then save up the rest. You wouldn't want no more until tomorrow.
This is how it was for nearly 2 decades. New York City getting a steady supply of pure heroin. But this all changed with the Second World War.
World War II is the panic of all panics in New York and other cities. Drugs that had been smuggled into the country in the 1930s just aren't around, or they're very, very scarce, and they're very, very expensive.
Under the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, the U.S. government began stockpiling massive quantities of opium in the late 1930s.
All opioid drugs are pulled off the streets out of illicit traffic and put in stockpiles, including at Fort Knox, where the gold is kept, as strategic materials. During wartime, we need lots of opioids, and we also need codeine.
Plus the fact the war itself disrupts international shipping and smuggling routes. Every single addict that we interviewed said that it was much more difficult to secure a regular supply of smuggled heroin in New York during the war than before.
And there was no drugs in New York, there was no drugs in Philadelphia, there was no drugs in Chicago, there was no drugs on the East Coast. No drugs.
It's all over. It's total victory.
But with the end of the war, a new chapter of New York's opioid story was about to begin.
After World War II, sales of heroin, particularly in New York City, erupt again.
With opium grown in Turkey and processed in France, the infamous French Connection was now supplying heroin to New York.
The world's busiest port for the trading of heroin.
And then something very important and very disturbing happens. There's a sudden increase in the number of new cases of youthful heroin addicts. The kids were running on the streets, and there were a lot of drugs. And their friends started using them, and then it became a cool thing to do. Another part of this is that, some of the heroes of the jazz world were notorious for heroin.
And what do young people do when they look up to somebody? No matter who it is, they start to emulate those characteristics and those habits.
It was easy for young, impressionable people to draw an inference that they were good because they were using heroin, and that was not the case. They were good because they were good, but heroin was seen as one of the keys.
With heroin flowing into the city to a younger group of users, the jazz musicians whom they looked up to became the target of Harry Anslinger. Largely credited as the architect of the war on drugs, Anslinger relentlessly pursued everyone from Charlie Parker to Billie Holiday, and the press began writing about the dangers of this new, younger heroin addict.
Suddenly, the newspapers and the magazines are full of stories about 18 and 19-year-old heroin addicts. Only now, many of them are African American and Puerto Rican.
In the middle of the 20th century in the United States of America, Hundreds and hundreds of teenage boys and girls are becoming hopeless dope addicts every year.
And those teenagers, they never had jobs. So the former generation had jobs and were convivial. The new generation, the younger kids, they start doing whatever they can to get money. That means they turn to street crime.
That gets the attention of congressmen. That gets a response. And the response is pretty heavy-handed.
In 1951, mandatory minimum sentences were established for drug crimes. And as the decade wore on, punitive measures increased.
There are 7 congressional hearings in different cities throughout the country. They bring all of the doctors who are studying drug addicts. They come to that hearing and they basically say, we should not be considering this a crime. We should consider this something that we should treat. And the outcome of those hearings was that those mandatory minimums from 1951 were stiffened.
Second and third offenses and selling in any quantity, even soft drugs such as marijuana, brought terms up to 40 years with no chance for probation or parole.
And these laws arrived as New York City was changing.
The gravitational center of American politics is starting to move to suburbs. So the jobs are leaving. It's capital flight in a lot of ways.
And the people moving in are black families from the South, Puerto Ricans, brought in through the Great Migration to get jobs during World War II, to escape the Jim Crow form of racial segregation in the South. But when they get to New York, as in a lot of other cities, they are shoehorned into particular neighborhoods. And so they are now raising their children in a place with booming heroin markets with very little generational memory of what it means to use heroin.
So you start to see in a lot of cities, and New York included, a generation of young people, largely people of color, too, who are fairly disaffected and alienated. And one of the properties of opioids is that they get rid of all of that. Like they bring a euphoria.
While black and brown neighborhoods were paying a much higher price during this post-war boom, mainstream media remained wedded to the white narrative.
Chuck finally talked me into using heroin. He said it would make him feel better. So I tried it.
The story was, now heroin has gotten to the white middle class.
In February 1965, Life magazine published a photo essay following the life of 2 New York City addicts, Karen and Johnny.
There are photographs of Karen interacting with police. There are photographs of Johnny when he is sent to Rikers. There's one of Karen and what is called her wake-up. So she's got a syringe in one hand and a cup of coffee, and in the other hand she's got a donut and she's in her house dress. These are photographs of a way of life.
This photo essay of Karen and Johnny would inspire the book and later the film, Panic in Needle Park.
The intersection at Broadway and 72nd Street on New York's West Side is officially known as Sherman Square. It's called Needle Park.
While the story of Needle Park offered a warning for the rest of the country, heroin abuse continued to rise in New York City through the decade.
And there were just a whole lot of people in their late teens and early 20s by the time you get to the late 1960s and the early 1970s. So the number of susceptibles in the population is at an all-time high.
But a new treatment was gaining traction. Methadone. Invented in Germany in the 1930s, the synthetic opioid reduces cravings and the withdrawal effects from heroin.
Methadone worked amazingly well in terms of normalizing the life of a person using heroin.
It is no different from people who today quit smoking by using nicotine substitutions. It's still an opioid, but so much better than using the garbage out there that you have to use every 4, 5, 6 hours and that you have to rob or steal to get.
And you could work, you could go to school, you could do all of the desirable social functioning that is very difficult if you're bouncing from getting high to withdrawal to getting high to withdrawal.
My first bottle of methadone, when I drank that, and in a short time, I noticed I evened off. I wasn't high, but I wasn't sick. I had a slight euphoria, but the nodding wasn't, I wasn't nodding all over the place, but I wasn't miserable. I wasn't sick.
By 1969 or so, you have about maybe 1,500 to maybe a couple thousand people who are on it. And then by mid-1970s, nationwide, it's tens of thousands. It's a meteoric explosion in the patient base.
Ladies and gentlemen,
despite the expansion, treatment was falling out of favor.
this is an unusual press conference.
The state legislature and the governor at the time felt that the prosecutors were not taking drug crimes as seriously as they should.
I have one goal, one objective, and that is to stop the pushing of drugs.
Nelson Rockefeller, with his eye on the White House, in January of 1973, says, we have tried everything, and what we need now are really harsh measures.
I have to say that as far as I am aware, there is no known absolute cure for addiction.
Passed in 1973, the Rockefeller drug laws mandated harsh prison terms for minor drug offenses.
It is the Rockefeller law which mandated 15 to life sentences. So the idea that you would lock away someone for life simply because they were not able to kick the habit and, and say, well, we gave them 3 strikes and they were out. Now we know it might take 20 strikes. It's draconian only begins to describe it.
What deterrent is there that makes a young person or a professional say, this risk isn't worth it?
By the mid-70s, the New York City drug market began to change. The French Connection had been disrupted, and a cheaper drug was gaining ground.
It was almost all cocaine. Heroin was a much more expensive drug then, much more expensive than cocaine too, and more expensive out on the street.
But despite its scarcity and high cost, as the 70s came to a close, heroin was about to become far more dangerous.
Somebody who was an IV drug user in New York was somebody who was playing Russian roulette with 3 bullets. What HIV/AIDS basically did is it put 2 more bullets in the gun.
With no medications or vaccine, contracting HIV back then was often a death sentence.
New York had the biggest AIDS epidemic among people who inject drugs, much bigger than any other city. By the time we had the antibody test, about half the people who inject drugs in New York City were already infected.
During these early days, Professor Don Desjarlais interviewed AIDS patients who had used intravenous drugs.
They knew that they were dying, and they knew that the participating in the research was not going to help them individually, but they were spending really the last hours of their life trying to help the research with the goal of preventing other people from dying of this horrible disease.
These interviews would play a critical role in the early understanding of HIV transmission.
They knew their own lives well enough that it couldn't be airborne, it couldn't be from touching telephones or anything like that. It really had to be through sharing needles.
Slowly, an information campaign was born, and needle exchange programs began to develop in the city.
We massively expanded access to clean needles, and we decriminalized syringe possession, basically. We went from 50% of IV drug users being HIV infected when I was using, it's now less than 3%.
Identifying it as bloodborne and then leading to supplying sterile needles to people who inject drugs. Undoubtedly saved hundreds of thousands to millions of lives.
By the early 90s, the clean needle movement had reduced HIV transmission rates by 50%. But a new fear surrounding heroin was emerging.
The images projected in fashion photos in the last few years have made heroin addiction seem glamorous and sexy and cool.
In the early 90s, there was predicted in New York City a surge of white heroin use that was associated with the term heroin chic.
We've got these young, strung out, glamorous white kids who are scandalizing the establishment. I mean, even Bill Clinton is denouncing this.
We now see in college campuses and neighborhoods heroin becoming increasingly the drug of choice. And we know that part of this has to do with the images that are finding their way to our young people.
That surge was interesting because it never really materialized.
If you look at the numbers, there are still far fewer of those skinny, strung-out white kids than there are aging members of this cohort of largely minority users who started using heroin in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
But while the public alarm was focused on heroin chic, a far more dangerous opioid chapter was beginning.
There's no question that our best, strongest pain medicines are the opioids.
2 years before President Clinton's remarks, the FDA approved a new opioid treatment for pain, Purdue Pharma's OxyContin, reversing decades of regulatory resistance to new medicinal opioids.
They tried for 100 years before OxyContin. There was that lesson that was very deeply, searingly learned in the late 19th century, which is even medicinal opioids can produce addiction. Addiction can get out of hand, and it can be very difficult to rein back in.
And so now, fast forward a century later, when we're in the 1990s, we now have a company that is seeking to maximize its profits and who has come up with a nice time-release tablet.
And then next thing you know, they're marching everywhere saying, oh, you know, we finally found it. It's the first synthetic opioid, and it's not addictive, not the way those opium-based ones are, and this one is going to be perfect.
The rate of addiction amongst pain patients who are treated by doctors is much less than 1%.
These are clearly people who have never met someone who regularly uses opioid drugs.
And so these drugs, which I repeat are our best, strongest pain medications, should be used much more than they are for patients in pain.
Within a few years of approval, overdoses started to rise rapidly in the United States, and OxyContin was all over the illegal markets of New York.
I remember where I was when I first noticed that. I was sitting in my office on a weekend reviewing our seizure reports, and I thought, wow, these pills are being prescribed. They're not stolen. They're being prescribed, and it gave me chills.
In 2008, New York City pharmacies filled over 1.5 million prescriptions for opioids. 2 years later, it was over 2 million. But as the federal government began to crack down on prescriptions, a familiar problem emerged.
Whenever you have a shift toward a more restrictive policy, you have a problem. And the problem even has a name. These people are called legacy patients. What do you do with the patients who started off taking prescription opioids, who became dependent, physiologically dependent on large quantities of these drugs? And now the medical establishment says, oh gosh, you know, we were wrong about that. You need to taper, or we need to be less liberal in prescribing these drugs.
As it happened 100 years ago, many moved from their prescription opioids to those available on the black market.
People were switching over to heroin, and then we started to see eventually fentanyl replacing heroin in the market.
Even for a city with 160 years of experience, this fentanyl chapter is unlike anything the city has seen before.
Fentanyl is a much more dangerous drug than heroin. It's much, much easier to overdose on fentanyl. It's much harder to treat fentanyl than it is to treat heroin addiction.
This is the biggest challenge we've faced. Last year's the worst year we've ever had for overdose deaths in the city. 80% of them are related to fentanyl, and there were more than 3,000 deaths.
And honestly, what's happening now is happening all over the country. It's no longer a New York City problem, it's a national problem.
If you or someone you know needs help, call the New York State Hope Line at 877-8-HOPE-NEW YORK or text HOPE New York 467-369. More resources are available from the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Support at oasis.newyork.gov.